So next, we have Paul Kohlhaas. He's a serial entrepreneur, economist, and Web3 engineer on a mission to build public utility networks, co-founder and CEO of Molecule, Democratizing biopharma research and development. Today, he will talk about how IP-NFTs and the biotech DAOs are democratizing medicine. Please welcome to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Cool. Hi, everyone. My name is Paul Kohlhaas. As introduced, I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Molecule. And we're kind of at the center of building this new decentralized science movement. So in the following talk, I want to kind of give you guys a rough overview of the why of decentralized science and what this movement aims to achieve. We'll look at the problems, definition, and goals. We'll then look into one specific vertical in the decentralized science movement, which is a deep dive into intellectual property and funding. We'll look at a very concrete example of where the space is today and what it's achieved. And then also look at this being really an inflection point for the broader open science ecosystem. Maybe before I go deep, a little bit of background. I actually gave a first talk about kind of this vague topic, this rough topic at DappCon 2018. So we've come a really, really long way of actually proving out that these systems might work. A little bit of background about myself. I really got into online biohacking communities during my teens. So these were different online communities, for example, in HIV and diabetes, also looking at psychedelic compounds that were essentially trying to develop new medication kind of online in these online communities. And I found that really fascinating. I went on and studied economics. And then during that time was trading biotech stocks. Found that really fascinating. And biotech stocks typically tends to trade at the burn rate of the company. And then you have positive data emerge about the drug that they're developing, and the stock goes 5x. Or you have negative data, and it goes minus 80% in a day. So a lot of similarities with the cryptocurrency space, actually. And then got really interested in open source, worked at Consensus for a while, and then in 2018 left to found Molecule. So what are the big problems in open science today? So science today is full of problems. On the one side, we have funding today is highly competitive and asymmetrically distributed. It's very difficult for scientists to actually get funding to research the world's most pressing problems. It's a very political process. Many scientists that we speak to, for example, say they spend 80% of their time fundraising and 20% doing the science. So it's even worse than being a startup founder. Science is often not very replicable. So when you have one scientist create a data set, and then another scientist or a company tries to reproduce it, they don't end up with the same results. And so in science, there's a very high propensity towards publishing only positive data and actually burying the negative data. Then science is very competitive in terms of publishing before someone else, in terms of being the first one to have an idea. And it's very difficult actually to verify that today. And then lastly, science is actually largely inaccessible today to kind of our modern awareness. We're much more aware about what's happening maybe in football, maybe on Instagram with the latest influencers, but we're not actually that aware of what's happening in science because it's quite intransparent. And a lot of these problems actually come from centralizing authorities in science today. So this is a trend that we've seen in many other industries, like the banking industry for DeFi. We've seen it in the art world with NFTs. Well, now it's and with science, in essence, it's actually the government that is controlling a lot of scientific funding. And then it's industries like the pharma industry, for example, that are fundamentally controlling what actually comes onto the market. So what if science was more decentralized? What would that world look like? And then there's the question, what is DeSci? So the decentralized science movement is really a movement that aims to create new public infrastructure for funding, creating, reviewing, crediting, storing, and disseminating scientific knowledge fairly and equitably using Web3 technology. That's a mouthful, and we'll digest more what that actually means. But why is it important? So the centralized institutions over the past, let's say, 60 years, and this came about really in World War I and World War II. Before World War I and World War II, science was actually pretty decentralized. It was just a bunch of people, a bunch of scientists across the ideas, essentially bringing ideas to life and disseminating scientific knowledge. But around the First and Second World War, science really was kind of industrialized and centralized. to develop new technologies to support those war efforts. But a lot of that, actually, those institutions and the bureaucracies that were built around the Second World War have persisted until today. And that's created a lot of inefficiency in our modern scientific funding ecosystem. So the decentralization of science is important because now users can participate in a trustless system in the same way that we can participate in a trustless system in DeFi. It lowers the risk of systemic failure. We've seen many systemic failures in science. One recent example is, for example, a very long-term Alzheimer's studies where many different Alzheimer's drugs were being researched, and then it fundamentally turned out that one of the earliest studies that unveiled one of those indications was just completely wrong. And so 20 years of research was almost invalidated. So that's a big systemic failure for a space. It's censorship resistant and fosters an open culture. So we are no longer able actually to suppress science, suppress good ideas, and it enables global collaboration. And then maybe one way to think about this, most of the world's potential scientific talent today actually remains fundamentally untapped. We have scientists, MD PhDs, master students, people running laboratories across the world in different academic institutions, and they're fundamentally even struggling to get by. The typical salary for, like, let's say, someone who's doing their MD PhD can range between like 3,000 or 4,000 USD per month. It's one of the worst paid positions. And now imagine if we treated scientists like we treat creators on Instagram today. Scientists are fundamentally creators, but they're one of the most underdeveloped creator economies, if we think about that. But if you think about it, they're one of the most important kind of stakeholder groups for a society. Yeah, and so one goal of DeSci is actually in the same way that open source software development or Web3 enabled kind of software developers from the world to kind of come together, and today someone can build a dApp from a garage in Nairobi or from Silicon Valley. There's actually no difference. And so in that sense, DeSci actually aims to level the playing field between scientists for society, for patients, for the people that need those outcomes. So why? Why are we building DeSci? To build an open science movement and to make science more collaborative and accessible to everyone. What are we building? We're building a global open alternative to the current scientific system that anyone can participate in a very similar way as DeFi did this for open financial services. And how? Fundamentally using different layers of Web3 technology to raise funding, to run experiments in the open, like we just saw with LabDAO, to share data and to distribute insights more openly. So what does this all look like in practice? We have different DeSci verticals that have been emerging over the past, really over the past 6 to 12 months. So this is a very new field. And one of them is funding and IP. Another one is publishing. Publishing data, publishing studies, then we have reproducibility of data and studies out in the open. So essentially when someone else publishes a data set, I should be able to almost run the code that produced that data set and end up with the same result. And the last big component is identity and reputation, essentially academic credentialing. We're going to focus later on quite in depth on funding and IP. And so now the DeSci space that is really emerging operates as a collaborative ecosystem in the same way, and sorry, I'm using DeFi a lot as an example, but I think there's actually some level of similarity if you think of these systems really being open Lego blocks. So this is the current decentralized science landscape. This is actually from, I think, from May or June. So there might be a whole lot more on this page at this point already. But suffice to say, the space is growing quite quickly, and it's gaining a lot of momentum. But by the way, most of these projects are open, like LabDAO, for example, like Molecule, like VitaDAO. You can join these communities and actively begin contributing. Many of them are searching for developers. Many of them are searching for investors, or actually scientists. And so essentially, each of these organizations are typically building a scientific network in a particular kind of field that they want to change. And as I mentioned earlier, of these verticals, funding and IP are currently seeing the biggest amount of progress, and we'll kind of look at how that works. So what is funding and IP more broadly? So to conduct scientific research, to run a study at a university or at a laboratory, or even, say, if you're a biotech company, you need funding to produce data. And you typically raise funding on the basis of distributing ownership in the underlying IP. So if you think, what does a university really develop, what value comes out of all this scientific research, it can be basic research insights that are for the public. But as soon as something goes into commercialization, where you think, cool, could we turn this into a new engine component, or could this maybe be a life-saving drug, then you're typically speaking about IP. So the fundamental value that is in a pharma company, for example, is just a large portfolio of IP. And essentially, the pharma company is now developing that IP to a point where it gets an approval from a regulating agency after having shown enough data that this particular drug or therapeutic is safe to use in humans. So what we're currently seeing, for example, is the retroactive public goods funding. Then we're seeing early forms of quadratic funding. For example, there's currently a Gitcoin round running on decentralized science where there's over 60 projects from across the world that have applied for this kind of funding. Then the third is funding through DAOs and tokenized incentive structures. So essentially networks of people forming to collectively fund a public good. And then the last one is IP-NFTs, which is a kind of a base infrastructure that my company Molecule has been developing, and we'll look deeper into that now. Maybe at a high level, how does innovation in drug development actually work today? So if you think about it, there are so many companies and so many universities out there in the world that are all trying to solve similar problems. For example, they're trying to cure a specific type of cancer. And the typical drug development pipeline, this process can take up to 10 years in today's system. So just imagine how long that is. I mean, I think when the first iPhone came out, what was this, 15 years ago? And this process can actually take 10 to 15 years to bring a drug to market. So the first iPhone came out, up until now, that's sometimes how long it can take to just develop one drug. And the current system is actually very inefficient in kind of identifying targets. So if you think about this kind of as a funnel of innovation, where now that innovation funnel is being conducted in one company, that company might have 10 targets, for example, to solve a specific type of cancer, and then it narrows those down to one specific target in the end. But now all of those companies are doing this research by themselves, and if you think about how science should work, science should actually fundamentally be open. And this has to do with a fundamental problem with IP. So actually, if I'm developing a new medicine or a new drug, I only have incentive to share positive data about that drug, not necessarily the negative data. Because if I'm running a biotech company, why would I tell other people that the drug that they were developing is actually not working? Often then, those drugs that don't work get sold on to other companies that try to take them further and ultimately fail in this pipeline. So this pipeline today suffers from a lot of information asymmetry. An IP, if we think about it, is fundamentally a non-digital asset. Our thesis is that IP today is broken. The IP and patents are still physical assets. You literally keep a box of papers from the government to claim your IP. And then this monopolistic design of IP that I just said really creates market failures. It limits collaborations in terms of how organizations can work together to develop IP. It limits open science. Negative data is not published. And it's very hard to reproduce. For example, if I'm a company that is buying let's say, a drug from another company because we want to develop it further, that company will only show us the positive data, not the negative. And then there's an issue with price gouging of end users. We've seen this over the past couple of years, that drug prices have become continuously more and more expensive. And it's essentially because IP fundamentally gives you the right to charge, to have a pricing function that's enforced by the violence of the government. One next big issue is these boxes of papers are not liquid. It's very hard to actually transact an IP. And then IP valuations are very hard. If you're developing an early stage therapeutic, and it might work, it might not work, it's really a complete sumfuck what the value is for these assets. But for example, an early stage cancer drug that has never even entered humans can often be worth an amount between $250 or $500 million. And it's never entered human. So the IP on this curve, as we saw here, the IP value actually grows exponentially as you go through these different phases. So our fundamental mission at Molecule is to really realign incentives in the system through decentralized biotech, which is one of these verticals in DeSci. And we consider this market to be a function of supply and demand. So on the supply side, we have innovation that's emerging all over the globe. And on the demand side, we have people, patient advocacy groups, maybe biotech investors, individuals that want to fund this research. And then ultimately, we want to make this research now, demand and supply coming together, an IP-NFT can be formed. We want to make that fundamentally owned by communities and by DAOs. So quick intro to Molecule. We're one of the leading DeSci infrastructure providers and DAO builders. We have about 5 DAOs that we're actively building out at the moment in different therapeutic areas. On our marketplace, you can kind of see just a screenshot of it here. We have over 100 different projects listed from universities across the globe that can actually now be funded through DAOs or through individuals. Cool. And so I'll go into the spaces of the kind of the biopharma IP-NFT. So there's been a lot of different, I think, applications already emerging around NFTs, dynamic NFTs, I think in the art space specifically. And so what we've been developing is a new form of IP-NFT, which is the biopharma IP-NFT. So it's a new fundraising mechanism for early stage research. It's a technical framework, in essence, that combines NFTs with federated data storage and access control to the underlying data. And it's a new legal framework. Yeah, little small blast from the past. This is one of my slides from at DappCon 2018. This was still pre kind of the development of kind of Molecule as an idea. But yeah, the basic idea for this came from, hey, what if instead of attaching a picture of a cat to an NFT, we attach a marker structure? So this little molecular design here is typically what you refer to as a marker structure. It's essentially if that you need for a composition of matter patent. So if you design and kind of create an entirely new molecule, that's the typical structure that you attach to a patent application. And my basic thinking back then was, what if we attach this to an NFT? And then actually, what if we make the NFT fungible through something like a bonding curve? Back then, bonding curves were quite kind of big, but they never really took off as a use case, but they actually went into AMMs. So you can now imagine if you take one of these IP-NFTs and combine it with an AMM as a Lego block. What would happen through that, you essentially create discoverability of the asset. So imagine if each of these, like were IP-NFTs and they were all publicly tradable. So you could see live data coming in, and you could essentially have people move in and out of these markets. So what is the basic anatomy of an IP-NFT? And by the way, this model is being applied in the wild already. We've funded over, I think I'm about to fund a sixth like full end-to-end university. But so an anatomy of an IP-NFT is essentially you have a legal component. So it's a legal contract and real-world license that's tied to the research or data. So if you buy an IP-NFT through our system, you're actually buying like the IP and the data rights from a laboratory, from a university. Yeah. And then it's a storage component. So there's a decentralized permanent data storage that has a public and a private layer. The private side lives on Filecoin and IPFS in a data storage component there, and the public side is on Arweave. It's now transactable. So you can now transact this research project between multiple parties. And ultimately, it's programmable. So you can now program the IP to have governance rights, to have fractionalization layers, programmatic royalties. You can implement pay-for-success models. Yeah, this again kind of goes into like a more technical diagram of the different components. So you have a legal contract, which is mapped onto a smart contract. That is mapped onto metadata and JSON. And then you have what's encrypted on Filecoin is essentially the actual IP patent and data. So you can kind of imagine this as like a decentralized private GitHub repo, where now different collaborators around an IP-NFT can plug in and co-develop an asset together. And this is completely groundbreaking in pharma. You can also transact, you can transfer this asset now within 5 minutes, let's say if all the legal checks out. But this is a process that could typically take up to 6 or 9 months with NDAs, multiple rounds of lawyers to actually transact one of these assets. So these first IP-NFTs essentially transfer and finance research and IP at early stages without needing to patent, to create a startup, or to raise venture financing. And these IP-NFTs are much more data-rich, so you can due diligence the assets in a much more transparent and open science fashion. I'm going to speed up a little bit, just because we're running out of time. So this is a typical pathway of how we envision one of these IP-NFTs going to market. Essentially, at different stages, you now have different groups of collaborators, or DAOs, plugging in to co-develop the IP-NFT. And then we fundamentally see these as Web3 Lego blocks in DeFi and DAOs. As I said, we're now seeing DAOs already build portfolios of these IP-NFTs. You can fractionalize these IP-NFTs. You can have these research data folders, and you can really make drug development much more modular. And all of this, we see all of this coming together essentially in a decentralized marketplace that we're actively building out. Sorry for the low res. Essentially, where these different research projects are listed, you can kind of imagine like an open sea for these different biotech research projects. And who's using this today? So there's a really great example. I think VitaDAO is one of the leading longevity DAOs in the space. So to date, it's funded over 14 projects with $2.5 million. There's over 20 projects under review, 7,000 members in the DAO. It's got in total about $7.5 million in assets. It's created a really active, essentially, research community, researching longevity and aging therapeutics. And so VitaDAO essentially functions through having a deal flow working group that now consists of researchers all over the world that are paid in VitaDAO tokens. And they essentially bring their IP through their laboratory network, through their academic networks, together into the DAO. And then Vita token holders now actively vote and review and curate these projects. And the end effect is that VitaDAO is today building one of the leading IP and research portfolios in the longevity space. Yeah, $2.5 million funded today. This is how this typically looks like, for example, on Snapshot. VitaDAO uses gasless, trustless voting. It's funded various different assets, some of them in equity, some of them in IP-NFT, but there's a strong move towards IP-NFT. Recently, one with the University of Copenhagen. This was last summer already, so now we're seeing first really good data actually emerge from this project. Another one with the University of Oslo. There's one with the University of Washington that happened, I think, about 3 weeks ago. There's another one with the Sense Foundation. And essentially, this funnel is now rapidly increasing. So the DAO is essentially like a vacuum now in Web3 that is sucking some of the most promising real-world research into Web3. And the cool thing is, once it's in Web3, any real industry participant has to kind of come to Web3 to get it out again into the real world. And fundamentally, what this is doing now, this is really democratizing ownership of core intellectual property and new medicines that are actively being developed. We've had a lot of learnings already, so if you want to, I'm happy to go more deeply into this, like what it actually means to build a DeSci DAO, what it means to build, as Nicholas said previously, a functioning decentralized research organization. One core learning is the academic community and the research community is the most important resource of the DAO. So you really need to build and cultivate a culture, a Web3 culture, where those people and those stakeholders in that culture is well taken care of. So where are we today? DeSci is really at a core inflection point. And with that, I mean, first, we're seeing a kind of a Cambrian explosion of projects that are launching in this space. But also, and this happened much, much, much sooner than we believed. So you have now all of these IP projects that are entering the DAO. And once they enter the DAO, they're going to stay there at least for a year or two. So they're almost taken off the market. So if you want to play in this market now and you think like, hey, there could be a groundbreaking new longevity treatment emerging here, you have to kind of join and work with the DAO. And that's where we're at an inflection point. So the biotech industry is actively joining these DeSci DAOs already. So this is an article from last week, 2 weeks ago, where Pfizer, the pharma company, actively is in a governance process to apply to join VitaDAO. And the reason why Pfizer is joining VitaDAO is because A, they find it extremely fascinating how these researcher networks, you can think, yeah, these researcher networks and neurons kind of come together and form in the context of a DAO, because this is actually something that Pfizer has been trying to do for decades, and they failed at it. They're failing to the culture and the incentive system to actually build an inclusive economy for scientists. It's almost like if you joined Pfizer as a scientist and Pfizer gave you a bunch of Pfizer shares. But they're never going to do that. So they're really interested in that. And the second thing is, though, they're actually really interested in, just go back again, in the IP. They're really interested in the IP that's developing. And with an interest to actually buy the IP from the DAO. And if Pfizer now approaches VitaDAO and says, hey, this is a really interesting project, we'd love to buy it, then, for example, VitaDAO can now fund a project for $300,000 and then sell it to Pfizer for $5 million. Because the value appreciation in early-stage drug discovery is actually very high very quickly. Or VitaDAO and its token holders can say, no, we want to keep this, we want to open source it for the good of humanity. We believe that these drugs shouldn't be commercialized. And what we're now seeing, essentially what's going to happen is what we're trying to do is build out these DAOs now in different therapeutic areas. So we have one already being built in synthetic biology and biomanufacturing. There's another one being built in mental health and psychedelic research. There's a DeSci DAO. The one before in SynBio is Valley DAO. There's another one focused on women's reproductive health called Athena DAO. And what we're now doing is we're essentially creating a biotech DAO launchpad and decentralized community to essentially help these DAOs build viable biotech business models and essentially integrate Web3 and the way that they work into the real world. If you're interested to learn more about that, come check out bio.xyz, which is essentially this new biotech DAO launchpad. Last couple of sentences. Where are we today? There's significant investment pouring into DeSci, and also a lot from non-traditional Web3 investors. So lots of biotech investors are actually taking note here. And these are funds and people that never cared about Bitcoin, they never cared about Ethereum, but they're fundamentally buying into this new notion of decentralized science because the effects could be profound. Many researchers are coming into DeSci that are fed up with their academic posts that are just, it's almost like if you're a software developer working at IBM and you find out about Ethereum. That's kind of the discovery process that these researchers are going through. There's tons of new projects and builders. There's also a lot of hype. Many of these DeSci founders are first-time startup founders that have just left academia. So you can imagine kind of the complexity for these people. The space needs a lot of experienced builders to actually make this a success. And then we need to avoid the mistakes of TradSci. So not TradFi, but TradSci. Essentially rebuilding similar cultural practices or like centralized bureaucracies that we have in science today. Cool. And I'm over time. And big thank you to all of you for being interested in decentralized science.
Thank you, Paul. I think we have time for one or two more questions, if you have. OK, here.
Yeah?
Yeah. OK. So would you say that then, when you were explaining about Vita DAO and everything, would you say that we can also look at Vita DAO as some kind of the future investment DAOs that would be focused more on the biotech research? Do you see like the growth of the ecosystem in that way? Or am I missing some of the deals there?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one way essentially to look at Vita DAO. But another way to look at it is almost like a decentralized laboratory. Because Vita DAO is not like, it's not a fund with like 5 or 6 people that are being like, we should invest in this, we should invest in this. But it's like, it consists of like 60 to 80 scientists, leading scientists from all over the world that are very actively working on these research projects as well. So around a research project, you might have a group of 5 or 6 scientists form. And now they actively work with the scientist. The scientist also joins the DAO. And they actively work kind of to define the next steps of the research, which is much more than what a pharma company or a biotech company would actually do. So, and it's almost this, this is also interesting where LabDAO kind of plugs in. It's like building these decentralized laboratory services that now make collective investment and funding decisions. So it's kind of like a mix between an investment DAO, but also much more like a network of researchers that actively work to democratize their research.
OK, and just to follow on there, in your opinion, let's imagine, as an example that you give, let's imagine that we as a DAO fund amazing research there. Yeah. And Pfizer or whoever comes and actually want to buy the IP for a really, really lump sum of money. How do you see the governance around that, and who would be parties involved in the huge discussion, OK, are we doing this or not, and who should have the saying, and in which way you think we should implement the governance around these particular questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. It's actually something I think that we'll see play out over time. But the DAO, in essence, is fully decentralized. And so even Pfizer wanting to join the DAO, Pfizer has to apply. So it put up even just think about this. So Pfizer is making a post on Discourse to like apply to join the DAO, and then there's different anonymous members of the DAO answering and asking Pfizer all these difficult questions. And now in about 3 weeks, or two to 3 weeks, the DAO will vote whether to include Pfizer in the DAO. And Pfizer is investing $500,000 that is contributing into the treasury of the DAO. Now, at a future point, all that Pfizer can do is vote with its governance tokens, which I think in this case would be about 0.5% of the token supply, a little bit less, vote with its tokens to like support their proposal. But all other token holders could vote no. So it's essentially the same political process that you would have in other DAOs. I actually think as a success metric for the biotech world, it would be a huge success if VitaDAO is able to like sell one of its assets at a later stage to Pfizer. But ultimately, it's really up to the token holders. If the token holders think, no, we don't want Pfizer to own this research, the token holders could decide to open source it. Let's say VitaDAO magically discovered like a pill that makes you live forever, the fountain of youth pill. And then VitaDAO could say, actually, this should never be commercialized. We want this to be open accessible to humanity, and we're just going to open source all of the IP, essentially destroying the IP value. And actually, because VitaDAO, like, so token holders don't have that, they don't have actually rights to the underlying proceeds from the IP. So it's really a pure governance token, but they can decide what to do with those proceeds. So token holders can decide to like not commercialize the IP, or they can decide to commercialize the IP. And then it's probably, with IP-NFTs then, you can have a similar bidding process as on OpenSea. You could, for example, say, cool, Pfizer is bidding 5 million on this IP-NFT, and that triggers an auction. And now there's a public auction running, maybe someone else actually comes and says, cool, I'm going to bid 7 million. And so you get similar dynamics as you might have in NFT marketplaces, which for pricing IP would actually be really, really efficient. And much more transparent. So the whole world could see, cool, Pfizer just bought this asset. Yeah.
We have time for one very short question and very short answer.
I don't know if this is going to be short, but on a follow-up, how do you deal with IP-NFT conflicts? Historically, the pharmaceutical industry has been plagued with people contesting research or claiming ownership, and in the real world, you can always submit claims to patents and go through a bevy of lawyers. How do you deal with something like that at a pharma level, especially post-pandemic, with DeSci?
Yeah, good question. So there's the Web3 answer. I mean, there's sophisticated arbitration mechanisms already in Web3 if you look at systems like Kleros, but I don't think they're going to hold up in the real world. So there's, I think, inter-Web3, and then there's actually everything external. And so all of these IP-NFTs are actually ledgered in real-world legal agreements. But the IP can infinitely be transferred, for example, through those legal agreements. It's like you make a sub-license of a sub-license of a sub-license, and that travels on. But it lives in the real world. And so these agreements are the same agreements that like a biotech company would use when they spin out IP from a university. So University of Washington says, cool, we will out-license this IP to this company. And we use those same type of legal agreements. So if an arbitration case or like if a dispute was to arise, we're relying currently on the same legal mechanisms to solve this. What VitaDAO, for example, does, VitaDAO works with specialized IP law firms in the jurisdictions that it operates in. So if it has a deal in the US, it'll operate with a US law firm like Greenberg Traurig. If it has a deal in Europe, it will operate with a European IP law firm. And then those law firms ensure that the same standards that we see in the legal industry are applied there. And then there's a crux where essentially the IP is put into a sub-license and can then travel through the NFT. The only big risk, I think, with these systems is that you could have leakage of the IP. But you can have that in the real world as well. If I work at a startup, and I know about some of their most promising IP that they found, and I leave that startup and like steal the IP and create my own company, they can sue me. And so with the IP-NFT, actually, whoever has access rights enters similar NDA structures as you would in the real world. And so if you break those agreements and you like leak the IP, then you can be prosecuted. That's I think where actually you raise a really good point. That's where DeSci is still clunky. Like things are more clunky than, let's say, in a purely trustlessly, permissionlessly DeFi world, because you still have permission access through these legal agreements. But also, you need them, because if you don't have them, then you can't like play the game. You can't like be in this field. But already with what we're seeing, like automating those legal agreements and then providing distributed access control brings so much efficiency to the space. But I think the hope is over time actually that like if you can really obfuscate the IP through zero-knowledge proofs, for example, you could have a world where you don't really need legal agreements anymore in IP-NFTs. So for example, if I can access, let's say, the data storage through zero-knowledge proofs. And so I would ask, does this molecule exist in the universe? And B, for example, does it have the data to is the data there that it says in preclinical trials that it cures cancer, just as an example. And if I run a zero-knowledge proof algo, and the algo can says, yes, the molecule exists, and yes, it can cure cancer, I've seen the data, and it returns that to me, then I could buy the IP without knowing the identity of the molecule or the actual underlying data. And that could actually make patents much more obsolete or really push patenting downstream, which has a lot of economic effects that we can go into as well. But I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for the question.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you. So